Hi, this is a short introduction to Freud's 3 parts of the personality and the psychosexual stages of development that each child passes through in order to further their course of development and develop the type of personality that will ultimately affect the course of their lives. The first particular division of the personality for Freud is the id. And id means it in Latin. And for Freud, the id was a collection of all of the unconscious urges that affected the individual by prompting him or her to eat, drink, avoid pain, seek out partners and company. So it's the instinctive. It is the purely impulsive part of the personality that is all that exists from birth until approximately 20 months of age. According to Freud, the id operates according to the pleasure principle, or the principle that states that human beings are pain-avoiding, pleasure-seeking animals who do all that they do to either achieve some pleasant experience or to ultimately avoid something which is unpleasant, aversive, or uncomfortable. According to Freud, this id, this irrational, illogical, screaming, impulsive part of the personality is or operates at an unconscious level. The individual has no awareness of the impact or forces of id, while it's exerting so much control over both our waking and even dreaming periods of life. The second part of the personality is what Freud calls ego. And ego comes from the Latin word meaning I. So when people talk about egomaniac, egocentric, they're talking essentially about a focus on the self. For Freud, the ego is ultimately a rational, decision-making, judging part of the personality that the person comes to identify as themselves. And it has the function of ultimately balancing id demands, impulses, and instincts with the demands of the world around us in terms of what we can or cannot do. And we'll talk about superego, that part of the personality that demands rule obeyed, which requires that we conform to societal standards and expectations. Ego operates according to the reality principle, which is the principle that I can't get what I want, when I want it, and in the amounts that I want it, because reality, others, my external environment all provide constraints on what I can do at any time. And ego operates primarily or oftentimes at a conscious level. So we're aware of what's going on around us. We can make choices. Ego involves pre-conscious forces, or the memories and information that we can pull easily from our memory system. What is my name? Where do I live? This is information that's accessible in our memory circuits, and ego uses these readily for decision making. Freud's third part of the personality is called the superego. And for Freud, this will emerge sometime near age 5. The superego is the moral component of our personality. It's the part of us that's going to be, it's the part of us that includes all of our social expectations, learned rules from early childhood, and all of the moral prohibitions and admonitions, thou shalt not, that we ultimately internalize as parts of our thinking. The superego will have 2 parts. The first part is conscience, the little voice in your head that warns you, don't do it, it would be wrong, you'll hurt others. And it's the part that punishes you when you do something wrong and makes you feel guilty or terrible about yourself for violating one of your internal standards. The second part of superego is ego ideal, by which Freud means those internalized expectations, rules, the schema for what is meant to be a good boy, a good girl, or some type of societal creature that functions in accordance with the rules. As it states here, we're not born with superego, but it will emerge in time as a result of interaction in early childhood experiences. And that takes us at this time to the development of our personality and the process by which we're born with we're born with just id, and we slowly develop ego and superego, and ultimately our personalities through early childhood conflict and learning. Freud believes our development takes place through a series of stages that are fueled by libido, or psychic sexual energy, that essentially energizes us to move through our processes of development. Remember, for Freud, the ultimate goal is always to increase our pleasure, and it's primarily instinctual, and to reduce any type of pain or unpleasant experience we could encounter or experience. For Freud, the first of the psychosexual stages, the first stage is the oral stage. And for Freud, at this stage, the focus of the child for its pleasure is the mouth. And according to Freud, the mouth is an erogenous zone. It provides sexual stimulation for the child between birth and, well, even beyond 20 months. According to Freud, development will take place depending on the amounts of stimulation that are occurring through the mouth in those formative years. For Freud, if the child is overly stimulated, that is, if the parents feed too readily, too quickly, and the moment the child utters a cry of hunger, mama pulls out breast and insists child feed immediately, the child will develop a certain personality orientation. If the parents are negligent in feeding the child, or only feed the child on a very rigid schedule, the child can develop another personality orientation. These two orientations, oral incorporative and oral aggressive, will possibly be fixed with some permanency in personality if the child isn't able to move through this stage with a bit more satisfaction and later stages. So two types of personality that emerge from this stage: oral incorporative, which comes from too much feeding, stimulation, leading the child to be excessively oral oriented, dependent, optimistic, needing to put things in his or her mouth, smoking cigarettes, eating candies constantly. Or if the child receives too much stimulation, the child ultimately develops, or can develop, an oral aggressive personality, where they tend to be mistrustful, they tend to be argumentative, and just at odds with parts of the world which in those earliest years seem not to meet the child's needs. The second psychosexual stage of development that the child will pass into between 18 and 20 months is called the anal stage. And in this stage, the child's focus for pleasure changes from being the mouth to the anus. And Freud believed that the anus was a source of pleasure for the child, that the act of defecation was ultimately something stimulating and rewarding for the child. But here's the conflict. Sometime emerging at about age 20 months, the child's ego or sense of self starts to develop. And when the ego forms, ego will exist to serve id and meet instinctual demands, like pee now, defecate now. And yet the parents will begin telling the child, you cannot defecate here. You have to wait for the potty. You have to meet society's expectations for the appropriate times for eliminating waste. If the toilet training doesn't go satisfactory, so if the parents are too demanding, if the parents are dismissive, rude, or even cruel and impatient with the child could develop one of two personality orientations for the rest of her life. The first is something that's called anal aggressive, where the child becomes excessively cruel, sadistic, messy, in a way almost as if the child is becoming a metaphorical poop slinger in rebellion to what the parents have done in these early years. If the parents, on the other hand, the child could also develop an orientation through bad toilet training of something called anal retentive. And in this sense, it's as if the child learns to hold back or retain feces to control its environment, to control its parents in some ways. And what we know of today as anal retentive is what we typically understand to be the excessively neat, tidy, obsessive compulsive types of personalities that we've seen in others. The third and final stage of psychosexual development, during which the superego will emerge, is called the phallic stage. And during this phallic stage, the child's erogenous zone moves from the anus to the phallic region. And for both boys and girls, what Freud discovers sometime after age 3 is that the child is becoming increasingly knowing and, we'll say, inclined to engage in self-masturbatory or self-stimulating activity. Well, at age 3.5 or 4, the parents who see this type of behavior will oftentimes try to suppress it because it flies in the face of social convention. In polite society, one does not touch him or herself. And as the parents start to restrain the child's behavior, the child is in a conflict situation where its instinctual needs, feel good, satisfy urges, come into conflict with society's demand of you're not permitted to do this at this time and in this place. For Sigmund Freud, this is the first great taboo that a child, and primarily in Freud's mind, a young boy will have to face, the taboo on masturbation. For Freud, approximately at age 4, the boy also starts feeling some urges to become one with the primary caretaker, Mama. And for Freud, this attraction for Mama is similar to the Oedipal story where Oedipus ultimately marries his mother. And this constitutes a second great taboo, that is the incest taboo, which Freud believes will possibly wreak havoc in the boy's relationships later on in life. Now, if the boy desires mom, and yet dad has mom as his own, we have a certain type of conflict. And for Freud, this conflict is very disturbing for the young child. The young boy unconsciously longs for mom, but fears that dad could do something violent about this. And Freud said this causes castration anxiety at an unconscious level for the boy. He fears that dad might take some extreme action about the boy's possible offensive organ, and the intense anxiety resulting from this competition and threat from dad is what stimulates the resolution of the Oedipal stage. The boy in turn, or at first, will think about fighting dad or killing dad, the third great taboo, but he realizes he can't beat dad, he must join dad. He must become like him to reduce his anxiety about the power of dad. And we say this is the process of identification. The young boy begins to identify with dad, begins to adopt his values, adopt dad's ways of speaking, and ultimately what this leads to is the formation of a superego, an internalized sense of right and wrong, good and bad, and the development of conscience. And for Sigmund Freud, if these stages all occur, the oral, anal, and phallic stage, if the child can work through these conflicts in a healthy way, the child will be prepared for later development in some other ways, for forming relationships, learning how to be connected with others. If the child gets stuck, like in the phallic stage, he or she will have personality difficulties, or we'll say personality limitations, which will affect them for the rest of their lives. Narcissism, inability to commit, different types of self-centeredness, which Freud will sometimes describe as phallic personality types. Well, welcome to Freud's strange and wacky world.